ever convince me any differently that the shots came from the area of the picket fence on the grassy knoll. No one will ever convince me. I saw it. I believe that's where it came from. And the only way that I'm ever going to believe any different is when I stand before the judge on the judgment day and he tells me. But I know what I saw, and that's what I saw.
Major Phil Willis, with his wife and daughter, was also in Dealey Plaza. He is certain that the fatal headshot came from the grassy knoll.
Hell, I'll tell you, 90% of the people in Dallas, Texas, and probably the United States have heard all this or have since decided that, as well as the second investigation held in the House of Representatives in Washington. And no one will ever convince me. I know damn well the shot that blew his head off came from the right front.
And it always seemed to me that had the car speeded up, had there been better reaction on the part of the driver, they were only yards from what at least I perceived to be safety by getting on the expressway. But the car seemed to just, it didn't move. After that first shot, it just didn't move.
On the morning of the assassination, Bill and Gail Newman had gone down to Dealey Plaza with their children to watch the presidential motorcade pass. They were the closest spectators to the tragedy, and their account is echoed by many others who were there.
The first two shots, I didn't realize what they were, but the third shot, after it was fired, I heard Mrs. Kennedy scream, "Oh no, they've shot Jack," and it was just sort of sent a chill over you. It was just terrible.
I can remember seeing the side of the president's ear and head come off. I remember a flash of white and the red and just bits and pieces of flesh exploding from the president's head. At that time, I turned to Gail and said, that's it, hit the ground. And we turned and hit the ground and covered our children. But when the third shot was fired, I thought it came from directly behind, towards the grassy knoll behind me. I based that primarily on the third shot from what I saw of the side of the president's head coming off and from the sound of the rifle, the report of the rifle.
He wasn't just the president elected by some unknown party out there. He was elected by us, the citizens of the United States of America. He was my president, and I felt very personally violated. And then to see him assassinated that way, so graphically, was horrifying. My president.
While the president lay dead at Parkland, another tragedy was unfolding a short distance from downtown, in the Oak Cliff district, where police officer J.D. Tippit had been gunned down by an unknown assailant.
It came out over the radio that the suspect had gone into the Texas Theater. Well, we continued on into the Texas Theater, and Kenneth and I entered the theater, and about the time we entered, well, some more officers came in behind us, and there were also some officers ran back.
While we were in the theater, probably 150 to 200 people had gathered out front of the theater, attracted there by all the noise. They had been told on television that the president had been shot. At this point, nobody knew whether he was dead or not. All these things happening this close together, they thought probably the suspect we had was maybe connected with the shooting of the president. And so we were hearing yells like, "Get him, let's kill him, let's take him." And we were all thinking, well, we just had to risk our lives and fight over a gun to get the man, and here we are, we may have to shoot somebody else to keep him.
When Oswald was first brought into the homicide office, I heard this commotion, and I looked up and I saw him. He was handcuffed with his hands handcuffed behind his back. And at that time, he refused to tell me who he was. He said something to the effect, "Well, you're the cop, you figure it out."
Later that day, Detective Rose led a search of the house in Irving, where Oswald's wife, Marina, lodged with her friend, Ruth Payne.
6 officers came to the door, and they said they had Oswald in custody for shooting an officer, no reference to the president, and they asked if they could come in. I asked if they had a warrant, and they said no, but we could get one right away, and they were obviously very tense and nervous, and I, was stunned by their arrival.
On Saturday morning, after the assassination on Friday, we went back to the Payne residence in Irving. I had obtained a search warrant from Judge Joe Brown Jr. and wanted to do a more thorough search than I had previously done of that residence. Some of the items we found in this search was a photograph of Oswald standing in front of a house with a rifle in one hand, a newspaper in the other hand, and a pistol on his hip.
At no time did I suspect he had any kind of gun. You know, that picture showed up later that Marina had taken. I recognized the location as the back of their Neely Street apartment because she'd taken me out there to pick some flowers to take home one time when I was visiting there in the spring before. As you know, that he was carrying both the rifle and the pistol at that point.
Other items we found was, of course, a small minotaur camera, it's called. It had a roll of film in it. We never did develop that film. It was later turned over to the FBI, so I don't know what turned out to be on that film.
We found a great amount of communist literature, communist books. I couldn't tell you just what all it was, but it was a large box.
We brought all the evidence in, and Captain Fritz decided to conduct a further interview of Oswald and had him brought into the homicide office for interrogation. I sat in on that interrogation. Captain Fritz at one point said, Mr. Oswald, you told us that you had never owned a rifle or a gun or a weapon of any sort. Is that right? And he said, that's right. I never owned a gun in my life. So Captain Fritz showed him the photograph and said, well, how do you explain this? He looked at it, and he got visibly mad. He seemed shaken, and he said, well, that's just simply my face superimposed on someone else's body there. That's all that is.
Another senior detective sitting in on Oswald's high-level interrogations that weekend was Jim Lovell.
Mr. Kelly with the Secret Service, who was the head of the Secret Service out of Washington, had flown in, I guess it was the next day, perhaps on Saturday, asked him if he knew anybody named Alex Hidell. He answered no, and they asked him if he had ever used that name at any time, and he answered no. And he said, well, isn't it a fact that when you were arrested, you had an identification card with your picture on it and that name on it and your billfold? He said, I believe that is correct. And Mr. Kelly said, well, how do you explain that? And he said, I don't. During my tenure with him, he was a very calm and cool and collected individual. All of his answers were very concise and to the point. He didn't volunteer information, and he certainly didn't admit to anything. Mr. Kelly also, in the same time when he asked him about the Alex Hidell, he knew that Oswald had been involved in this fair play for Cuba in New Orleans. And he asked him, he said, now that the president has been killed, he said, do you think that the attitude of the United States towards Cuba will change? And Oswald looked around to his left where Captain Fritz was sitting, and he said, I believe that I am charged with the murder of the president. Is that correct? And Captain Fritz said, yes, that's true. And he turned back to Mr. Kelly and he said, I don't think that I should answer that, because whatever answer I give you might be construed in a different light than what I intended it to be. He said, however, in all countries, and this country is no exception, when the leader of the country, he either dies or gets killed or something, there's always a second in command that takes over. And he said, in this case, I believe his name is Johnson, and I don't think that his views towards Cuba are any different than the president.
An early arrival at police headquarters was the FBI agent in Dallas who'd been assigned to keep an eye on Oswald prior to the assassination, James Hosty.
His behavior when I talked to him on the afternoon of the assassination for approximately 1 hour was that of a person who was very calm, cool, and collected. He claimed that he was in the lunchroom at the time of the assassination by himself. He was also asked by Captain Fritz, did he bring a weapon into the building that day, and he said no, he had not, but he had seen the manager, Mr. Truly, had brought a rifle into the building a day or two before. This was later checked out and proved to be true, that Mr. Truly had brought a rifle in and he was going to go deer hunting with it and shown it to several of the people in the building. The interview was terminated because Oswald was taken out for a lineup.
Oswald was placed in 4 different lineups, 3 on Friday, a 4th on Saturday. In the first 2 lineups, Oswald appeared with 2 police detectives and a jail clerk. These men were wearing clothing quite a bit nicer than Oswald, but moreover, they did not resemble Oswald in appearance. They were heavier, older. One of them had blonde hair. The police gave fictitious names and occupations. Oswald gave his real name, his real occupation, to Texas School Book Depository. This information was being widely disseminated even by the time of the first lineup. In the second and third lineups, Oswald appeared with men who were quite a bit heavier, older. Some of them had blonde hair. And in the 4th lineup, which was the most outrageous of all, Oswald appeared in the lineup with 2 teenagers and a Mexican. And in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th lineups, Oswald complained bitterly to police about the manner in which the lineups were being conducted. And he berated the police, demanded legal representation, and it was very, very apparent to any witnesses that Oswald was the suspect. There are established criteria for the fair and proper conduct of police lineups. By any stretch of the imagination, every rule in the book was violated by the Dallas police in the conduct of each of the 4 lineups that weekend.
When they first filed against Oswald for killing President Kennedy, they put in the complaint that Oswald did kill President Kennedy in the furtherance of an international communist conspiracy. The White House called down to the district attorney and vehemently objected to that, in which then the district attorney removed this statement from the original complaint. Because of this, the White House was extremely upset with the local authorities, and we were under the strictest orders not to give them any information whatsoever at all about Oswald. This caused them to jump to the wrong conclusion and think that we were hiding something about ourselves when we were really cloaking the information about Oswald's Soviet and Cuban connections.
In Mexico City, 2 months before the assassination, a man claiming to be Oswald had visited both the Soviet and Cuban embassies, demanding a visa allowing him to travel to Russia via Cuba. He was unsuccessful. The American authorities were aware of this trip.
I asked him if he'd ever been to Mexico City, and he became quite upset about that, but this was more, he was more startled. And he said something to the effect, "How did you know about that?" And then wouldn't speak about it anymore.
Whether it was Oswald or an imposter in Mexico City, it was a connection that the American authorities were anxious to conceal at all costs. James Hosty gives the official explanation for this cover-up.
Oswald had been in contact with V.V. Kostikov, who was the Soviet KGB chief of assassinations and sabotage for the Western Hemisphere. I think the fact that Oswald had been in contact shortly before the assassination with a person of that nature, and due to the fact that he had spent 3 years in Russia, this would have caused the American public to become so outraged that it could have led to World War III. I believe for this reason they decided that they would keep this from the American public.
Whatever the real mission was in Mexico City, the American authorities at the highest level were determined that it should never be revealed.
In Mexico City, the CIA agents were instructed to cease and desist their investigation of a possible Castro connection to Oswald's assassinating of President Kennedy. There was a near mutiny among the CIA agents over this order to stop the investigation. The ambassador to Mexico City stated he was given orders from his superiors to stop the investigation, and then commented, well, if the president's own brother agreed with it, I guess we'd have to go along with it, which would indicate to me that Attorney General Robert Kennedy concurred with the order to stop the investigation of the Castro connection to Oswald.